Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa DePuydt, and I am really excited to be here today with you all in Tokyo and on the live stream back home. Hi, Mom and Dad. And I'm going to be sharing with you today about a mindset that I call AMP Core. It's a mindset that my team has developed at the Washington Post on our Ark Publishing tools, and we use it when we go into clients and build their new sites on top of our tools. So we've heard a little bit about the Washington Post today already, so no pressure. You have heard from Malta that the Post recently won a Pulitzer Prize for content that was published via AMP stories using some of the Post's proprietary technology. And that technology is our Ark Publishing software, and that's the team that I work on. Ark Publishing is an award-winning, state-of-the-art set of digital tools for modern publishers. And I've been on the team for about 3.5 years. Specifically, I work on our professional services team, so that means I get the honor of going into other publications and working with their stakeholders to bring new experiences to life on the Ark platform. Over the course of the last 3.5 years, I've had the opportunity to work on implementing some of the greatest websites for publishers on Ark, and it's been a real honor, both big and small clients, in moving them over to Ark. Now, I didn't start out as a technical architect. I started out as a boot camp graduate when I got my offer from the Washington Post. It was in October 2015, and it was to the day, coincidentally, tied to the same day that I got my offer, was the day that the AMP project was announced. So you can imagine my kind of trepidation, knowing that I was going to be working for a media company, and learning about this new project that the Post was part of at the very beginning, and learning that the skills that I had spent the last few months learning would not even be part of the AMP spec, with JavaScript, very limited CSS. And so I saw this as kind of a potential point of frustration. But as I've started to work with AMP in projects over the last couple of years, I've been really excited to come around to this mindset that AMP is more than just limitations. It's actually aligned with some of the best practices for software engineering. Chances are you've been on a project that sounds a little bit like this. You get a set of requirements, and you're told that the site has to do X, it has to do Y, it has to do Z, and it also has to be AMP compliant. And in this kind of waterfall delivery style, AMP is often an afterthought in requirements. It's not something that's up front and center yet. And so what happens when AMP is an afterthought is that we build a default or a non-AMP experience, and then at the very last minute kind of come back and be like, oh yeah, the AMP part. And then we dive straight into the technical spec. And that's a reasonable thing to do as engineers, to go and read the documentation. But when we go straight into the technical limitations of AMP, we miss the bigger picture in starting to see what AMP can offer us as engineers. So what happens most of the time when AMP is an afterthought is that we end up maintaining two different sets of code. This is something that Paul mentioned in his intro, that you have your non-AMP and your AMP experience, and pushing more people to go AMP first. And we've seen this shift from mobile first, or as mobile first has grown, we've gone from having a desktop version of our site and a mobile version, your www and your m-dot, to just having one version that's responsive. And that puts some constraints on the chaos of requirements a little bit, but I still have issues with mobile first because it's not very well defined. And so that's why I've started calling my mindset AMP Core. The AMP Core mindset is one that's based on AMP's design principles. What you heard from Malta earlier was a little bit about the mission and the values of AMP project. And under the hood, AMP also has guiding design principles that help them make consistent decisions. In the AMP core mindset, you use these design principles to help you align with stakeholders across teams at the very beginning of the project. And then the downstream impact is that you see performance benefits on both your AMP and your non-AMP renderings. But before I go any further, I do want to clarify that AMP core, as I'll present it, is not the same as the AMP first mindset that you've heard about already today. In AMP first, your AMP rendering is your only rendering. It is the canonical version of your site. But on my team, and I suspect at many other organizations at the moment, having a canonical AMP experience is not really an option at the moment. And that's where I think that AMP core is really powerful. It lets you take all of the guiding principles of AMP and distill it into a mindset that can inform your development for your paired sites. I've developed this mindset in projects where we've had paired sites, so AMP and non-AMP. And that's not necessarily a limitation of the Ark platform, but just the state of the requirements for the projects we worked on. So the AMP core mindset starts out with a process that I call AMP design thinking. If you're familiar with the concept of design thinking, it starts out with a period of empathy and learning what matters in a project. I think of it a little bit like this marble. When you have so many different competing priorities, they all get blended together. And it's hard to suss out what really matters on a project. With the design thinking process, you can work with your stakeholders across teams, so not just your engineering managers, but people from product and marketing and advertising, and get everyone to buy in at the beginning. Once you get stakeholder buy-in on the principles and priorities for a project, it tends to limit the scope a little bit. But at this point, you should still be thinking much more in the abstract, not even looking at the technical limitations, because stakeholders don't actually care about the technical aspects. They care about what it means in a language they can understand. And that's why the design principles are so valuable. They communicate the things that you care about as an engineer to your stakeholders in terms that they care about. Once your stakeholders have bought in, that's when you can get down into the technical specifics. I'll talk a little bit more about what this looks like for us at Ark and how we've gotten here. But the first thing I want to kind of dig into is the idea of design principles. Design principles are a way of capturing the guiding light and vision for a project in language that everyone can understand. Typically, they're going to be able to express the authorial intent for a project for the people who are involved from the beginning so that they can inform future decision-making on a project. This is not exactly a new concept within software engineering as a whole. If you think about the Zen of Python, those are design principles. And if you think about maybe Ruby on Rails, the idea of convention over configuration, or the model view controller mindset, those are design principles within software engineering that we use to make internally consistent decisions. Now, that's a phrase I've used a couple of times, and I actually borrowed it from our friends at Google, because when I was digging around for information on software engineering design principles, I kept coming back to this quote from Google. It's on their AMP website under the Values and Mission section. And it says, "The design principles guide the ongoing design and development of AMP. They should help us to make internally consistent decisions." To me, this was a light bulb moment, and I just went, oh my God, because I realized that I was really frustrated on projects that did not have internally consistent decisions. I realized that the vast majority of projects I was on did not have clear priorities, and it didn't have those design principles there to guide when things got tough. So I realized that all of the projects that frustrated me were the ones that had very erratic decision-making when the priorities changed from day to day or like hour to hour. So the design principles are meant to be the underpinning for all of the decisions on a project. And so when I think about design principles within software engineering, I want to get really vague. I'm not talking about limits on CSS or limits on JavaScript, but really kind of the core things that we think of as priorities as software engineers. Now, I'm a front-end engineer, so I'll speak specifically to my experience. But these are some of the things I think of as software engineering principles. I like to remember the user experience and keep in mind who is going to be using my product. I also remind myself time and time again to keep things simple and to not repeat myself. From a performance perspective, I like to remember that things should be efficient, that my code should be clean, and that if something fails, I shouldn't break the whole application. So, unsurprisingly, the AMP design principles line up almost one-to-one with things that we would consider engineering best practices. AMP has design principles that say the user experience is greater than the developer experience, that we should design for the browsers we have, not for a hypothetical future faster browser. They say it's important to not break the web and render things on the right layer. Those are all things that matter to us as engineers, but expressed in terms that matter to stakeholders. They don't mention any particular language or any size limits. They're a common way for us to express our priorities to stakeholders across teams. So I didn't just magically end up at this mindset. It's been quite a journey over my time at Ark. So like I said, I started out as a very junior web developer and have worked up through the levels at the Post to where I am today. And over those years, I've gotten to work on some pretty awesome projects and helped develop this mindset. We started out with our very first implementation of AMP on our client Infobi. Infobi is a publisher in Argentina that is a huge success story. They've more than doubled their traffic on all platforms since moving to AMP. We built their non-AMP site first, and then afterward, they came to us and asked for an AMP implementation. So right from the get-go, we knew that it was going to have to be paired and that there would be two sets of components. But a funny thing happened as we started to dig into the technical spec for the first time. We realized that in the absence of any other requirements, we could build a very, very fast website for them that wasn't necessarily AMP compatible. That wasn't what they wanted, because they wanted AMP specifically. But that was the light bulb for me. The AMP was something that we could use as leverage in conversations with stakeholders. It's a common framework that's already in production that has all of the things they want and gives me the things that I want: speed on the site and performance benefits. So I knew that I wanted to be able to take this idea a step further, and I got my chance when we worked on the Tribune Interactive projects. Tribune Interactive has many different publications in the US, including the New York Daily News, shown here. And right from the beginning, we wanted to take AMP as a priority, so we wanted to take it seriously. And so we did that by going into our discovery process with the design team and establishing what some of their priorities were. Their priority, in this case, was a consistent brand experience across all rendering tiers for them. So in order to accomplish that priority, we sat down with their design team and decided that we were going to follow a design system. The design system would have the guidelines for us to implement against, but then we also got to walk away and say we were going to impose a technical limit on that. In order to have consistent branding, we needed to be able to use the design system across both the default and the AMP, or the non-AMP and the AMP version of the site. So we built that accountability into our build process with a Webpack size limiter, and that was very helpful down the road when we encountered things in the design system that just needed a little tweak or maybe just added a little CSS. The size limiter gave us a really concrete way to say, no, this one tweak or one extra thing actually violates one of the principles that we set out at the beginning. And so the conversations we were able to have with their design team were so much more fruitful and productive throughout the project because we agreed on those things up front. Now, with this project, we still ended up creating 2 sets of components, one for the non-AMP rendering and one for the AMP rendering. So we still had a little bit of a ways to go in order to really kind of flesh out AMP at the core as a mindset. We got that opportunity with our client in Germany, RTL, last year. RTL is one of Germany's largest broadcasters, and they came to us to launch a new experience for their users on the web. We had a really tight timeline, but we knew that AMP was a priority up front, and we knew that we wanted to launch AMP at the same time as the default or the non-AMP experience. So what we ended up doing was taking the design system idea from Tribune and pairing it with this idea that all of our components should, by default, be AMP compatible, and only certain components, like the video player, which you can see it looks a little bit different between the non-AMP and the AMP versions, only the components that need to be switched out should even have a duplicate rendering in our code base. This led to us being able to launch the AMP experience at the exact same time as the non-AMP one, and also makes it easier for us to maintain in the code long term. So we're not at the point with any of our projects where we're doing a canonical AMP or an AMP first implementation, but that's what I think makes AMP Core so valuable. It's the logical extreme of AMP first for any client or any organization that isn't able to take advantage of AMP first. Instead, we're able to take advantage of the guiding principles for the AMP project as a whole. So what I want to leave you with is some concrete steps that you could follow to implement the AMP Core mindset at your organization. I'll use the example of a hypothetical publication needing to redesign or re-platform their website with a certain set of priorities. So it might look like this. We would start out by gathering a cross-functional group of stakeholders where we get together and discuss the actual principles and things that matter to us. This might be different from a different perspective for product. It might be the design and the branding. For advertising, it might be the speed with which their ads load. But as the discussion unfolds, you'll want to make sure that you're not actually getting into the technical specifics yet. This should really be the high level, what matters to us in this project. Then, once you have some kind of coalescing around certain principles, you'll want to lay them out as the ones that are your project's design principles. Specifically, you'll need to frame them in the way that works for your organization. I like to go back and revisit the AMP design principles at this point and figure out which ones we're gravitating toward. So in the example of a publication that's doing a redesign project, one of the priorities or principles they might agree on is that the pages should load quickly. That would be the most abstract way to say the site should be fast. And then you might get a little bit more specific and say pages should load in 1 second. You could even get more specific than that without getting technical and say pages should load in 1 second for first-time visitors or for repeat visitors. Or pick a specific metric that you could measure, whether that's time to first paint or like DOM complete. Whatever it is for your organization, make sure it's framed in a way that everyone can get on board with. And again, that's not just everyone who's an engineer, that's everyone from every department that has a say in the project. Only at that point should you walk away from the table as engineers and determine exactly which technical guidelines you'll need to follow. At this point, this would be where you would say, if we want pages to here we go. If we want pages to load in 1 second, here's exactly the performance budget we can afford. Here's the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript that we can afford to send to the browser on that first load. And then bring that back to the larger group so that you can make sure that everyone is still on board with what that means. It's really easy to be on board, of course, with saying my pages should load in 1 second. It's a little bit trickier when you realize that you only have a certain amount of HTML and CSS and JavaScript to work with in order to achieve that goal. But if you've already aligned on the goals up front, it should be much easier to get that buy-in from people across teams. The last step, and arguably the hardest, is keeping everyone accountable. I think that the easiest way to do this is to build the accountability into your regular processes. For us, that means imposing a size limiter on our design system for the CSS, like I mentioned. This runs as part of our Webpack build process in our CI/CD servers, and so we're never able to just scoot around it or ignore it just this once. It's something we're constantly thinking of. We also like to bring it up at regular stakeholder meetings, making sure that everyone is still aligned with the things that we agreed on. And when push comes to shove and things get a little bit tricky to deal with, we can always go back to the most abstract version of the principles and remind everyone that we're on the same team and that we all agreed on these things at the beginning of the project. Now, the AMP core mindset might look a little bit different at your organization, and it may not feel like the right thing for your team. What I can tell you, though, is that with the AMP core mindset, you'll have the best chances of keeping yourselves aligned with everything that AMP stands for, which is software engineering best practices in general. So I'd like to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to me today. Feel free to find me at the conference and chat about Ark, about AMP Core, or about anything else. I really appreciate the time.